field of forensics and neuropsychology for the past 30 years or so. And most of my work had surrounded schizophrenics a long time ago and how they think and the memory processing and so forth. And then I transitioned into sexual abuse and sex crimes after I started working with kids in foster care. And from then on, it then, I guess, just segued into human trafficking. So at this point in my career and my life and my professional life, I'm working more in the field of human trafficking and child sexual abuse. So, I've been following the Kavanaugh hearings quite intently, and I'm at this point sick in my stomach. So if I seem to digress every once in a while, that's the reason. It's kind of ironical to talk about human rights and child rights on a day where a victim's voice is being silenced almost for various reasons and understandable reasons, but still it's very, very tragic. So I'm going to talk to you today about the United Nations, the Convention for the Rights of Children, but use that as a framework within which we talk about foster care, we talk about child maltreatment, we talk about human trafficking, we talk about poverty and homelessness. They're all interconnected, as you already know. But I want to give you the numbers and the data because we already know that as common sense. But I want to provide you with data. And if you already know this, just tell me, hey, skip over the slide. We know this. It's old knowledge. And also connect that with the brain and trauma because, the brain is always where my heart is anyway. And so, or what I care about so deeply because everything is in the brain and all our actions and emotions are directed by how we think, feel in the brain. So I'll speak about that, and then I'll discuss also, and I'd love to open this up for discussion, where we talk about where do we go next? Where are we? Have we made any progress, really? And where are we in terms of where we used to be 30, 40, 50, 80 years ago, and where we are today? As a species, have we really made any progress? We talk a lot. We have lots of conferences, we have a lot of meetings, but have we genuinely made any progress? And I say that with a lot of sadness because of what, the proceedings from yesterday, which I actually was up till almost like 4 a.m, just following all of that. I was just, because we had calls from survivors, I had people being triggered. A lot of my survivors were calling me in the course of the night, so it was pretty intense. So I'll talk to you briefly about, this is the framework against which we're going to be talking, the Declaration of the Rights, in 1924, which was adopted then in 59, and the 4 core principles against which we have to judge ourselves and our colleagues and what we do, because we profess to work for children, but in the course of what we do, how much harm are we actually doing to the kids? How successful are we in reaching out to these children and the families, and how fair are we in the judgments we make? And I'm a clinician, so frequently I'm given the role of making these judgments and then sending them up to the judge, who generally pretty much goes with what I say and what the state says and what the prosecutor says and so forth. And so the judge has an extremely difficult role. And as much as I talk to them and I train them, it's a tough position. It's always a lose-lose position almost for them when you look at it. And I was listening to the gentleman who spoke previously. My heart went out to him because I understand how much pain there has to be not having your kid with you and not being able to have justice done. So there's 4 core principles. With one is non-discrimination. Second is the standard that I'm always struggling with, which is the best interest of the child. Who really is qualified to decide what's the best interest of child? Am I, as a clinician, qualified to do that really? Is the parent far more qualified? Is the social justice system qualified? Who really is a child qualified to make that decision? When do we say a child can make the right decision? On what basis can we interview children? Because especially when you do custody evaluations, I do a ton of those. I've stopped because I just got fed up with the whole way we do it. But when you do custody evaluations, the biggest part we look at when you look at best interest of the child is how healthy or how mentally and physically together and well adjusted is a child, in which home is a child well adjusted, and why. A lot of it goes to the presentation of the parents, which is really very, very misleading. Very intact parents can break down terribly in a situation of prior child custody. That's their life, that's their kid. And they can come across as being quite unstable in courts. Whereas the more unstable parent can come across as being very calm, very peaceful, and very together in court. So it's very tricky in the courtroom when judges have to then see these parents. I talked to a judge, I worked very closely with these judges in the court system here in Lake County, Indiana, where I live and work. And one of the things they've always said to me is that it's really difficult to discern the mental stability of a parent by courtroom appearance because it's extremely misleading. So again, devotion to the best interest of the child, what does that really, really mean? It's something I'd like to talk about further on as we go, and I'll try to weave all of this into the discussion. The right to life, the right to survival, the right to development. And when we talk about this, what is development? It's human development in the brain, physical development, psychosocial development, cultural development, development in terms of socio-emotional functioning, all of these aspects of human development. And how much do we really give that right to survive? If you have a children at 4 years old and 5 years old making brick kiln in a factory or begging on the streets, what is the quality of that life for that child? And how does that impact the development of the child moving forward? And then the respect for the views of the child, how much do we really take all of that into consideration, and how does that impact our decision making in the US? So a child in the US attends foster care every 2 minutes. Every 2 minutes. The previous speaker spoke about the ACEs, so I won't go into great depth, except that it actually informs me in my decision making, and it has for several years. The reason why ACEs is so important, and again, I won't repeat what the previous speaker said, but the reason why it's so important is because adverse childhood life experiences is what social justice systems, the child welfare system in America is actually driven by. So if a child has a history of child sexual abuse, neglect, psychological abuse, emotional neglect, and there's a family history of intimate partner violence, which is what we call domestic violence in the family, and if there's substance misuse in the household, there's household mental illness, there's parental separation or divorce, and a parent is incarcerated, a household member. It could be a parent. Frequently, it's an older brother. So we have a sibship of, say, 6 siblings, right? So the older brother or older sister, usually it's an older brother, who is incarcerated. That impacts how the rest of the family handles the younger siblings. It impacts also if the breadwinner, say the father or the mother, is incarcerated. The mother's selling heroin, she's using heroin, she's doing drugs, but she's also working full-time. So how does that impact when she goes to jail on charges of heroin, and she's a single mom, and she's got 5 children? All those 5 children enter the foster care system, right? Because we don't have that level of intact home preservation where we say, let's provide in-home services to this family, because if we provide in-home services to this family, we actually save each family, by the way, costs in America about $11,500 a year. to keep intact. Okay? Whereas when you put them in the foster care system, multiply that by 5. So the cost to foster care is so much higher, and the socioeconomic burden on the country is that much higher because of foster care. Because we're not able to put our children in intact families and provide the kind of service they need. So that's what's happening. And I'm not against foster care. You know, I work in the field of foster care, and I sometimes assist child welfare with should a child go into foster care or not. But the cost of breaking up a family is so serious that foster care in America is now shifting and looking at the best interests of the child because of the Casey family studies that have come out over the past 10, 15 years that are very damning about the long-term impact of foster care. It is very serious, and that's why we're looking at it differently now. So I'll briefly talk about the impact of trauma and the impact of when you remove a child from the family. It's something I call displacement trauma. Displacement trauma is a process when you remove a child from the caregiver and then you put them in a place where they're away from their primary caregiver. Now, the primary caregiver can be a biological parent, it could be a grandparent, but you remove that child from the primary caregiver and you move them to a strange household. There's homelessness that starts from that stage. Homelessness does not begin in foster care when children age out of the foster care system. So all those studies can be very misleading. Homelessness actually starts when you remove a child from their primary caregiver and from their home and put them in another home, because the chances of them being moved from that home to another home, to the third home, to the fourth home is increased. So they're basically homeless and moving from place to place, like moving from shelter to shelter to shelter, and having a roof over your head and food to eat and a school to go to, which changes every time you move. So at the average age, the average length that children stay in placements, or the number of placements rather that children have during their childhood, is about 7 to 8 placements in foster care. Okay, and there's an area right here, I don't know, you can see this word temporal lobe, but right below the temporal lobe, deep in the recesses of that lobe, which is our memory functions. That's the purple, the pretty purple. Of course, the brain is not purple or red or yellow. It's just the staining that was done to make it easier. But deep in the recesses of that brain is our emotional brain. That emotional brain holds our traumatic memories. So there's a left and a right brain. This is a segment, this is a lateral picture of it. But in the recesses of that brain is the whole emotional brain with a pea size. It's kind of like the size of a pea, so tiny, but that's called the amygdala, and it holds all our traumatic emotional memories. And these memories are encapsulated so that when you talk to children and you ask them, well, how are you? They're going to say they're fine. And you ask them why they're acting out. They honestly have no clue, because the verbal brain, which is that red portion, which is our frontal lobe, has no access to our deep emotional brain. So there's 2 pathways by which messages go to the brain. But I won't go deep into this because I'm not doing a brain lecture here. So let's go back to foster care. And the reason why I brought the picture of the brain is to let you understand why foster care impacts our children so much. Those traumatic memories of being removed from a family, removed from people you love, removed from everything you've ever cared about and known in your whole life, those memories are stored there. And that impact is what you see in the ACEs years and years later. So the decline of children, 33% found that the new studies have found that because of looking at because we're trying to look at the best interests of children, we're trying to see what works for our kids. The Casey family studies, the Child Welfare Gateway research, all that research that has come up, the ACH research that has come up, the foundation's research that has come up, they have all pointed towards a negative long-term impact of foster care, negative long-term impact of removal of children. And so because of family preservation, because of stability of placement that has been pushed, because of education of foster care. So parents or caregivers, for example, go through intensive training in foster care. And now we're training them on human trafficking, which I'll speak about shortly. But because of the amount of training and the level of training they're getting, there's an increase in stability in foster care placements that we're pushing toward. And we're trying not to have these parents say, you know what, 14 days, I need this kid out of the house. We're saying, you know what, if you're going to get this kid out of the house in 14 days, we're not giving you any more children. So we're learning ways in which we can control and protect the foster care system from getting completely as chaotic as it used to be before. There were no controls. There was no outcome measure that we could say if we control for these factors, then the outcome for our children is that much higher. And now we're increasing in that. There's more research that's coming out, which is very, very good. So an interview of alumni found that 24 to 25% of the alumni in foster care were actually molested in their placements. So here we're saying we're trying to look at the best interest of the child, removing the child from the home, but what we're essentially doing is putting them at higher risk for child sexual abuse. And that is the problem. We're putting them at higher risk of child sexual abuse because in these very homes, there are other children who were sexually abused. So then these children become sexually, what we call sexually reactive children. We don't call them perpetrators because they're acting out what was happened to them. And they're still very, very young. So we call them sexually reactive behaviors and puts all our foster kids, any kid that's put in that home, as a potential victim for sexual abuse. When you look at family preservation versus foster care, we had studies have found that in Indiana, in Michigan, in California, when they broke up the intact family situation and they stopped funding, that literally happened. They stopped funding intact families in Illinois. There are about 10 to 15 cases more, in percentage more cases that ended up in foster care and ended up with a higher level of abuse. So that has been a major concern. In group homes, now we say, okay, the kid is failing, what they call failing, and I really don't like that term at all. But they use that term and they say, kid is failing in foster care. Therefore, after 3 failures in foster care, we put this child in a group home. Okay, because that is a next level of care. So there's levels of care, right? There's foster care, there's group home, and then there's residential treatment after that, after the kid is hospitalized. So these kids are then have greater than 10 times incidence of physical abuse, greater than 28 times incidence of sexual abuse than the general population. So we see how the outcome measures then change. So the question is, how do we look at the best interest of the child if you're unable to provide primary protection for our kids? And granted that the ACEs are higher, and this is the argument I do get, the ACEs are higher when they've come into the system already. They do have a family history of sexual abuse, or they do have a family history of physical abuse, or a family member is incarcerated. So the ACE is already 4 or above. And when you are at 4 above ACEs, and I can get that slide back to you if you ever need that, but when you are 4 above, that puts that individual at 7 times higher risk for substance abuse, 28 times at higher risk for child sexual abuse, and 20 years lifespan decrease. That was a very recent ACE study that was done, that these individuals are put into, who have high ACEs, even if they're with intact families, they end up having a 20-year shorter lifespan than the others. And the reason why is because they turn to drugs and alcohol. they become homeless. And you know, with the homeless population, there's what? We have 220,000 families that are homeless in America. So the homeless population, there's malnutrition, there's attacks, there's a greater level of attacks on homeless people than there is in the general population, as you know. So there's a lot of that's going on. Then if you look at Illinois, Iowa, and Arkansas, they have the highest rate for reunification. So Iowa, Arkansas, and Illinois, and the spelling is incorrect here, but they have the highest level for reunification. And the requirement in the states across the country, the requirement in the states is to reunify or adopt these kids out within 12 months, as fast as possible. Arkansas reunifies them at 77% within the first 12 months. Illinois is the lowest. And I'm really sad to say that because that's my neighboring state. So what is this pipeline that we talk about? From school to prison, what is our real pipeline? We have from foster care to prison pipeline, and then we have a school to prison pipeline. So if you look at this, you're looking at 40% of students expelled each year are African Americans. Look at the issue of race relations and expulsion from schools. 70% of students in school arrests were referred to law enforcement. But if you looked at foster care, and I'm going to move this more. If you look at foster care, youth of color are more likely to be Black or Latino, 50% of which in the foster care system, 30% of which enter the juvenile justice system for behavioral issues. And usually the biggest behavioral issue is running away from a group home. And I'll tell you why that is really important. When they run away from the group home, there are human traffickers who are 3 houses or 4 houses away from each group home in our country. And the human traffickers pick up these kids who are running away from the group home, and then our foster kids get trafficked, which is why the rate of kids going from foster care to human trafficking pipeline is higher. 25% of them leaving foster care will be incarcerated within the first few years after turning 18. 50% will be unemployed within a few years after turning 18. These are current statistics. Get back here. So if you look at facts of foster care and homelessness, 4,600 of our kids, which is 20%. So if you have 23,000 children aging out of foster care, about 4,600, which is a current statistic at this point, about 4,600 become homeless. Of these 4,600 who have become homeless, you're looking at substance abuse issues. You're looking at them being very, very vulnerable for trafficking or anything else for that matter, for becoming victims of crime, for being recruited to commit crimes. So these young people do not have the wherewithal or the cognitive and emotional stability to be able to handle this level of a change in their lives. Remember that in foster care, their lives are so controlled that if they have to sleep over, usually the case manager has to know where they're going. Their lives have been so controlled for such a long time that when they age out, they go from total control to total discontrol. So some states have given them $5,000 and say, you know what, you're aging out, we want you to make a living, we want you to be able to pay for rent and so forth. So out of sheer guilt, they give them the $5,000, and you think these kids are able to manage those $5,000? You know what they tell me? I bought a TV. I bought a 50-inch TV. Now, where they're going to put that 50-inch TV, I have no idea. You have to have a place to put that in. And remember, these kids are often homeless and they can barely pay their rent. So they buy TVs, they buy video games. They're still socially, emotionally, cognitively most foster kids are about 2 years behind our average intact family kids. Given they have that gap between where they were and where they should be, or where they are and where they should be, we are not giving them the protective transition or the ability to fall. If you do not fall and skin your knees, you're not going to be able to realize that next time I better watch my step. And that's not what we're teaching our kids. We're saying we're going to protect you, protect you, protect you, but we are setting you up for failure in your later years. So what we're essentially doing is, are we looking at the best interests of your children? Are we giving them life support? Are we giving them supportive life skills? Are we looking out for their survival? Are we looking out for their development? Remember, there's 4 core principles for children. Are we really doing any of that? And if we are, how successful are we if our outcome measures are so deeply troubling? And so we're failing our kids in ways that we need to rectify, and we put Band-Aids. Because every time I give one of these talks, or we have meetings or conferences, or I go to the child fatality team, and the child fatality team reviews what I call the dead babies meeting, because it's all we review is dead kids. And that's once a month. And these kids are dying from gunshot wounds. They're dying from SIDS. They're dying from partner abuse, family domestic violence. They're dying from a whole host of reasons that we are not taking into account when we're trying to protect them. So even though the intentions are good, the intentions are to protect the children, the intention is like, you know what, I really want to protect these kids. I'm going to take them from the house and give them a really nice house so that they have food to eat and they have a bed to sleep in. And then they grow up. And when they grow up, where are they going? Where are our kids going? What are we doing to our own children? This could be my kid, could be your kid. Just because they're not our personal kids doesn't mean they're any less important. And so out of aging of these teens, 1 out of 2 kids, 1 out of 2 teens will have a job, but 1 out of 2 teens will not have a job by the time they're 24. If you don't have a job, you're at risk of being in survival sex. A lot of our teens are going for survival sex. And I talk to them, I said, what's going on with you? And they'll say, I can't help it. I have to eat. And just to eat, they will have sex with anyone that person selects. So they have what they call a harem. So there's this trafficker and he'll have 6 kids in that harem, 6 women, 6 girls. And you know, when they all get together, what they talk about? Their history of child sexual abuse, their history of neglect, their history of mom being beaten black and blue, or their dad being beaten. It's not always the mother who's being beaten. It's the dad just as much. People don't talk about it as much. And so this is what they talk about when I see them in the clinic and I say, hey, why are you doing this? How can we change life for you? And they look at me and they say, you can't. There's nothing you can do. So 7 out of 10 kids are pregnant by 21, 60% convicted of a crime and become homeless. And in the entire country, there's 12%. Granted, it's less than other countries, but we shouldn't be that high. And if you look at CSEC, by the way, CSEC is a commercial sexual exploitation of children. It's called CSEC. And if you look at the preliminary US, the 2016 stats, 881 runaways were discharged. You know why they were discharged? Because we couldn't find them. And then you'd spend only so much time looking for them, and then you're like, we can't hold them as DCS or DCFS, the Division of Family and Children. You can't hold them anymore because they really are not there. And by that time, they're probably 18, so they get discharged. For almost 5,000 kids who are runaways enter the Department of Child Services because parents call them out as runaways. 12,000 to 13,000 youth were abandoned by the families. I'll have parents who come in here, not for any other reason than that the kid is acting out. And what they will tell me is, I can't handle this child anymore. I'm remarried. My husband does not want this kid disrupting our other children. He's got 3 kids. I've got 4 kids of my own. This one kid is difficult and taking too much of my time and destroying my new marriage. So you know what they will do? They'll say, hey kid, I'm leaving you with the state. The kid enters the state, abandoned. You think this kid feels any value, any sense that I have a right to survival, I have a right to development, I have a right to life? No, this kid is going, I wish I were dead. I shouldn't be alive. No one cares about me. I don't deserve to be alive. And that child is then vulnerable for multiple crimes against children. So 1 in 6 kids who run away are victims of, they're picked up by traffickers within 48 hours. So think of a child running away, and within 48 hours, that child is picked up. DMST is domestic minor sex trafficking, DMST, domestic minor sex trafficking. This many kids. About 300,000 kids at risk for DMST. We have 800,000 children at this point missing in America. We have no clue where these 800,000 children is, and that's an estimate, by the way. But we have recorded about 470,000 children missing. And the reason why I tell you that is because there's sting operations that are done on a yearly basis. There's a sting operation that's done by the FBI. They rescue children during the Super Bowl. And when they come to rescue children from Super Bowl, they were able to identify only 10% of the children they rescued. 10%. 90% of those kids, they didn't even know they had disappeared. They had no idea who these kids were. We have far more kids who are disappeared than we have kids that we know are missing. Add to that the number of missing adults, and you have a nice figure there. So shifting from foster care to human trafficking. So you saw the foster care to prison pipeline. You saw how that whole dynamic happens right from infancy and ACEs all the way up to the prison dynamics and homelessness. All of that, this is all tied in together. These are all cogs within this wheel of a disastrous situation. And I don't want to paint a completely negative picture because I want to highlight the fact there's a lot of good work being done in the country. The problem is we're playing a catch-up game, and we are running, but the car is at 90 miles, and we're running at 10 miles. So it's far ahead of us, and we keep trying and running faster and faster and faster, but we don't have the funding, we don't have the sources of collaboration between NGOs. We don't have the communication between NGOs. We don't have the overall framework within which we say, hey, let's all work together. Because even though we say these things, when push comes to shove, it's cutthroat. It's cutthroat for grants, it's cutthroat for space, it's cutthroat for everything we do. It shouldn't be that way. We need to all collaborate. We cannot compete because the pie, which people say is just one, and take a piece of that pie. I tell people, go build another pie. Make another pie. Join hands, let's work together, because unless all of us in our different fields of expertise get together, we're not going to be able to protect what we really have set out to protect, which is the child and the family. So the UNODC has 3 parts of the protocol, which this is a protocol which is called the Palermo Protocols. This is a convention against transnational organized crime, one of which is human trafficking. And I'll stick with human trafficking because between 63 to 93% of kids who are trafficked said they were once in foster care, depending on which study you look at the UN, at the United States. And so our average number of kids who are trafficked is about 85% who said they were once in foster care. So clearly, we have a lot of work. So human trafficking has acts, means, and purpose. So in the US, we don't have to have consent of the child under 18. In certain other countries, we do. And if you look at the Rome Statute, then it is the crimes against humanity. There's enslavement. The Istanbul Declaration of 2008 was endorsed over 100 countries. And we talk about organ trafficking with that. And it's about a position of vulnerability. And I use the word vulnerability frequently because it always takes me right back to ACEs and those vulnerabilities and our kids in foster care. Whether it's in America or anywhere in the world, ACEs is a very relevant project. And what we're doing, my organization, which is a Safe Coalition for Human Rights, what we're doing in conjunction with Vincent Filletti, who you heard about earlier, is one of the co-developers of the ACEs project in CDC. And Vincent and I are going to be working on the ACEs, expanding the ACEs to be more culture specific. We have cyberbullying as an ACEs, which we don't have it from the 1998 study when it was actually done. We have organ harvesting. We have migration as a huge ACEs. Kids are migrating from place to place right now across our borders. We have the kids from South America coming to US, and we have no idea where 1,400 to 1,500 kids are. No clue where these children are. So we don't know where they've gone. We also don't know if biological parents are bringing them in. So we don't know if these kids are being transported by traffickers who are posing as biological parents either. It's very complex. It's far more complex than we wish it was. So it's a recruitment and transport and transfer and harboring or receipt of children. And with organ transplant, there is the same thing, but except it's organs. If you look at the other major international conventions, you have the 1926 Convention to suppress the slave trade, the ILO Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the suppression of traffic in persons and the exploitation of the prostitution, the ILO Convention in 105 and 182, and the child labor one in 1998, and then the 2011. You know, we still haven't ratified the TIP, which is the transport of persons, the trafficking of persons. For this year, it hasn't been ratified. And one of the reasons it hasn't been ratified was Congress is more busy doing, as you know, a whole bunch of other things. And it hasn't ratified the Trafficking Persons Act, which seriously needs to be ratified. What's that? Okay. Oh, my internet's, so what is human trafficking? I won't go in depth into that, but I think you know. I want to speak briefly about adoption trafficking. So this is not something people talk about a lot. But I had a transnational adoptee. He was trafficked from India to Germany. Adoption trafficking is a huge problem in India because the kids are being trafficked through the term adoption from birth by hospitals with very unsavory practices. They're being trafficked at birth or a little bit later in orphanages. They're put into orphanages, kidnapped, put into orphanages, and trafficked to Australia and Germany. Usually it's Australia and Europe and America. So these are we are the second largest destination nation for human trafficking. And adoption trafficking is very, very big. So there's legalized adoption, which is actually part of adoption trafficking. And there's also surrogacy trafficking. The reason why legalized adoption is trafficking is because these kids are really not up for adoption. The parents, oftentimes in villages in India and Nepal and some of those countries, the parents sleep outside. You know, the weather's nice, it's pleasant, the sun, the stars above you. They literally put their little cots outside the house and they just sleep. And in the middle of the night, these kids are being kidnapped from villages. In fact, there was such a fear in one of the villages in India, and one of my friends was telling me about this, that there was this video on WhatsApp that was being sent around in villages, and all these villages have WhatsApp and all these apps, right? They have all these smartphones, and there was a video going around that there was a trafficker trying to find children, and they were naming the trafficker. So this one poor girl got beaten up because they thought she was a trafficker, and she wasn't. But this was a fake viral video that went around that village, and 3 villages actually were involved, and so legalized adoption has become a big scare in the Indian subcontinent because of the kids being kidnapped. And surrogacy trafficking is another problem where they will pose as surrogate parents and say they want to have children, and then they produce these children, and then what happens is trafficker then takes these babies and then they're sold for as sex slaves. I won't go in depth into that because I have one case that just absolutely, I don't even know what to say about that case. So this is what I'm talking about, the Indian subcontinent with the physical exploitation. These kids are actually being brought into the more developed countries, such as the European nations. Into Australia is very, very big on that. So there's internal trafficking, about 85%. So one of the things we look for is what are we doing to our children, and how are children protected, and how are we actually able to prevent these kids from being trafficked into the US or out of the US for the matter. Our kids are not only being trafficked within our country, they're also being trafficked outside the US to other nations. And that is usually when our young girls go out, they go to these islands, and this is what's happened with one of my cases. They go to these islands and they go and party there, and they're young, they're underage, they can drink because no one's asking them for an ID, right? As long as you can pay, you're good. So they get trafficked because these kids then get kidnapped and taken, or they get drugged. And then they enter sexual acts, and they'll tell them, I'm going to send this video of you doing XYZ to your family. And then we lose our kids. So that's one of the saddest ways by which some of our children are going. And then there's sexual tourism that's happening with our children, where people come from out of the, so think about tourists, right? We all are tourists. You go to Europe, right? We go to Europe to travel for conferences, whatever it is. And so when there's sexual tourism and there's children then, say Thailand or Singapore, that become victims of trafficking with foreign tourists who go into those countries. So in Thailand, you could buy a child for $10 or less. So parents are literally selling their children. So it's a huge issue there. But I don't go in depth into that. I just want to share this just to keep that in your subconscious, so that as we talk about this. There's a young lady called Ortiz, Wilhelma Ortiz, and she is. We call her Thelma. And so she actually was trafficked from foster care, and she gave one of the most profound and moving testimonials in Congress several years ago. And she's struggling now. And I talked to her, I think, a couple of years ago, and where she was telling me that she can't even pay for college. She says, I want to go to college, but there's no family I can turn to that'll help me pay for college. I don't qualify for any kind of benefits. I can't apply to college, and when I apply to college, I can't pay. So I have to drop out each semester, work an entire semester, and then apply for college, then go back to school. So she's in school, out of school, in school, out of school. How do you finish grad school? How do you finish your undergrad? Going back and forth. Where do you go for Christmas? Where do you go for New Year's? Where do you go for Easter? Nowhere. You're the only kid staying in the dorm. Think about it. So our kids, when they age out, we have really nowhere to protect them. There's no protective scaffolding that happens to them after they leave. Just a wonderful, very articulate speaker. If you ever want a speaker on something on foster care and human trafficking, call her. She needs the money. Please call her. So LGBTQ is a big group. It's an increasing group. And we talk about ACEs. This is going to be part of the group we talk about, where we're going to be speaking about how does the LGBT group, how are they in terms of protection of human rights? What are we exactly doing for the human rights? How are we protecting these young people? And the tragedy is that they are at the highest risk for human trafficking because parents do not want to accept that their kid is transgender, bisexual, you name it, whatever it is, but they don't accept it. So these kids end up being kicked out of the house. If they're not kicked out of the house, they're leaving home because they're looking to belong. And when they're looking to belong, who do you think they're going to turn to in order to feel that they belong? They're going to turn, most likely, to a human trafficker who seems like a really sweet older lady, very kind, very nice, says, don't worry, I'll take care of you. Your parents don't love you, but I do, and I'll do everything I can to protect you. But gee, you know what? Month later, you know what? You've been really expensive for me. I've had to buy you shoes. I've had to buy you stuff. I can't afford you. You need to sleep with this person for me. You need to have sex. They won't say sleep, of course. You need to do XYZ to this guy in order to pay your bills. And that girl will never, ever be able to fully pay her bills because she'll keep owing and owing and owing. It's basically bondage at this point. So when you're identifying victims and you're looking at the signs, these are the signs we look for. For children at risk, we're looking for survival. Children have the right to survive. Certainly they have the right to survive, but not the way we're making them survive. Or we are very inadvertently asking them to survive. We don't mean to. But then, if you give a certain set of circumstances to a child, that child is going to survive within those set of circumstances because that's all they know. And so if sex trafficking is all they know, if being sold is all they know, and if that's the only thing they're actually good at, quote unquote, because they're failing in school, they're not able to attend school regularly, their self-esteem is really poor. It's like one girl told me, she said, this is what she said to me. She said, Doc, after doing this for 3 years, my body feels like it's in pieces. My body is in pieces. I don't have a body. I just feel like I'm just all these parts of me, and I don't know who I am. I can't do this anymore. And she finally got caught or rescued, so to speak, because she ran away from home to go to her trafficker because her mother had grounded her. And her mother had told her, until your grades come up, kiddo, you're not going anyplace. She ran away. And when she ran away, mother reported her as a runaway, and they were able to pick her up. Less than 1% of our kids gets rescued. Remember the number I gave you, 800,000 plus? We have no clue. Less than 1% of our kids get rescued. And of those kids we rescue, 78% of those go back to the trafficker. 78 to 80% go back. And the reason they go back is because we don't have the services, we don't have the protocols in place to protect our children. And if they have a right to be protected, if they have a right not to be discriminated against, if they have a right to give their views and to tell us how they feel, we are crushing those rights. So again, if you look at the facts and figures, we have 40 million people who are victims of modern day slavery, mostly migrant workers. So if you look at Florida, there's a place called Immokalee. I don't know how many of you are from Florida, but I work there every once in a while. And so Florida is a place called Immokalee. Labor trafficking is where all that happens in Immokalee. Labor and sex trafficking. You know, your orange, your oranges that are picked up. Where's your coffee coming from? Did you know? Where's your smartphone? Look at your smartphone, right? Your smartphone parts are coming from labor trafficking victims. So we have so much we take for granted that we have no idea where our stuff is coming from. So we're encouraging people to say, look for fair, what says fair trade. If something is fair trade, it means that there's no trafficking in that company. The company does not do labor trafficking, is not doing any form of bondage trafficking for children. So these are global facts and figures. China and India, forced marriages are the highest. In America, we have forced child marriages. We have about 4 states that have actually put legislation to combat that, and we have several states that where the trafficker can the child rapist or the pedophile can actually marry the child, and then the kid cannot press charges. I'm not sure what happened here. I think I'm frozen again. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, you have frozen, but we can hear you.
Do you want me to turn it off and turn it off again, or just continue?
Are the slides essential, or you can convey the?
No, they're not essential.
Okay, well,
yeah, they're not essential. We're actually almost close to the end because I wanted to leave time for discussion. But essentially what I wanted to talk about is when you look at the conglomeration of labor trafficking, sex trafficking, homelessness, poverty index, foster care, and we look at all of this together, they're all connected because these kids end up in prison or they end up dead. And the tragedy we're having is that our kids from foster care who are trafficked, they don't have more than a 7-year lifespan. So it means if they're trafficked, usually which is in middle school, which is right around at the ages of 13, 14, 15, they don't survive to even become young adults. And that is one of the biggest problems we are facing at this point. Like, how do we educate? And this is what I'm pushing toward. We need, in order to improve the physical and emotional health of a child and the psychological health of a child, we need to make them more resilient. And resiliency is actually a gene that was discovered. But if we can build resiliency by building blocks and just by helping them, where we actually tell them, hey, you know, these are the skills we've got to teach our kids, and then we give them exercises by which they build resiliency, right? From being extremely hypersensitive and crying because, I know, someone said something mean to you, to saying, you know what, yeah, this person said something mean to me, but I can overcome it. It's okay. It's not about me. It's about them. So when you switch the dialogue and you make kids more resilient, they are then more resilient in fighting off trafficking. And secondly, they're more resilient in terms of recovering from the trauma that they've gone through. Because everyone responds to trauma differently. And what's traumatic for one individual is not traumatic for another individual. And at that, I'll end because we have 15 minutes and I want to make sure that we can take in some discussion. Or half an hour, we can do some discussion. So go ahead.
Anyone have any questions or comments? Well, it's really depressing.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to be depressing, but I'm just giving you where we have kind of, you know, where we need to go. Because, like, and I let me give you some positives. So I don't make you cry. So the positives are these. Okay, so we are moving towards family preservation, increasing family preservation. So we're putting more dollars where it really matters. So, for example, the Health and Human Services is funding all sorts of initiatives to fight human trafficking far more than it ever has. right? So America is, for example, a tier 1 country, which means that we're the highest level of combating human trafficking compared to other nations, right? We're also putting more money into training and education. So the Health and Human Services, again, has a technical training branch, and they send people around to do training. And if you actually compare our country to many other countries, we are far more proactive than some of the other countries out there, even though our figures don't look really good, right? But we are far more proactive than some of the other countries that are out there. So I want to throw that out there, that we are doing what we can. And what's really beautiful is the kids who were trafficked, the kids who are in foster care, are now actually on the boards of most of these organizations. They have a group, there's a circle of 12 trafficked kids who are actually, or young women rather, young men and women, who now actually tell us how we can go forward. Survivors are coming forward, victims are coming forward. Like you see, we talk more about sexual abuse now than we ever did before. We talk more about domestic violence now than we ever did before. So we're making progress, but the human condition, ultimately, we have to deal with not only the good, but also the not so great part of the human condition.
Dr. Gopal, I have a comment and then a question. First, my comment is that my concern is that there needs to be more consideration of how the phenomenon of persistent U.S. legal system abuse leads to the picture that you're painting with regard to the vulnerability of the children. Because if we hear your presentation, and it's not difficult, no one has to do a legal brief to understand that we're talking about a travesty, that we're talking about tragedy. And persistent U.S. legal system abuse is one precipitator of this picture that you're painting, where you have children that end up displaced from their nuclear family and put in foster care, and the pipeline starts. It's not the only trigger, but it's definitely a significant trigger, and the extent of the contribution of this court abuse needs to be considered, particularly in the context of family courts, criminal or mass incarceration, and the contribution of U.S. legal system abuse to mass incarceration. Is, in other words, not just public policy, but actual discernible misconduct. And then there's another big population, whistleblowers, who the persecution and psychological torture they experience, how that impacts their children, and perhaps to create these cycles that you're talking about. So that's my comment. Now, my question is, we're trying to mainstream the notion that there even is such a thing as persistent U.S. legal system abuse. When you have a topic such as you address, that regardless of how at times it can be discouraging and frustrating about your progress, it's a mainstream concept. No one's going to get mad at someone that they're taking into consideration, the best interests of children, how to keep children from getting in the foster care system and getting through the pipeline, trafficking, prison, that sort of thing. So if you have a concept that's, I would say generally, is definitely mainstream, is not widely embraced, then why is it so difficult to get people working together? And why is it that we're to the point that we have to look at international instruments for relief? Why isn't this all something that can be addressed in the context of, the U.S. Constitution, the domestic law? And I apologize that one of our speakers keeps she's having technical problems. That's why she keeps coming in and out. But if you're having those type of obstacles and you're looking to international instruments for relief for these children, when you're dealing with such a sympathetic topic, how could that happen? And what does that say about us dealing with a concept that we're trying to mainstream that is now very controversial?
The question is extremely urgent. I think that we need to be doing what you're saying we're doing. But the problem we are having, and working with the legal system in the US as long as I have, the biggest problem is the education and a mindset. You're looking at a mindset, right? So the mindset is that we are doing everything we can in order to protect the child. That's a mindset. And the mindset is that, yes, in the process of taking care of, 500,000 children who are in foster care system, there are going to be 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 kids that we fail. That's a mindset. And the mindset is that not if there's a preponderance of children that we're actually protecting, then our legal system is not broken. Does that, are you following my, okay. So if the legal system is not broken, why fix it? That is the problem. So when I talk about the foster care system being implemented in the US and being implemented in Europe, for example, the UK, and now it's come to India and Nepal and those countries, I say, why are you taking a foster care system that obviously has a lot of, holes in it? Why are you adopting it as blindly in other countries? Instead of that, we need to be focusing on what we can do to make the people who are the caregivers healthier. It's far cheaper to put a third person in the house as a caregiver than to break up an entire family system. But that is a concept that people are not willing to be open to because it would mean losing money. And it's unfortunate. It would also mean losing money in a billion-dollar industry.
Doc?
Yes?
If I may, this is Gordy Weiberg. I don't know if you can see and hear the rest of the world, but actually you look pretty well just standing still like that.
But go ahead, I can hear you. I see you as a still picture, but I can hear you.
Your microphone has gotten muted again, so for some reason.
You did that.
I know I did.
She does that all the time.
She's just trying to keep you awake, that's how she
does. Yeah, well, she's failing. One of the issues and questions is, and I saw this in law enforcement, criminal justice, and in the courts, is when we base the majority of our assessment and criteria of the welfare of our children on statistics. We have, through your presentation and everybody's presentation, we talk about statistics, 500,000, 800,000, whatever it is. One of my concerns is that tends to desensitize the population to the problem, because when there's only 20 or 30,000 of 800,000, and we can look at it as 10 or 15%, well, then it's no big deal. Then it's something that we can get through, and that means we must be being successful. Even if we fail 20,000 children, it makes me sick.
Yeah. We can't hear you again. We got a short. We can't hear you. There you go.
I'm saying it makes me sick to my stomach to think that we're thinking about 20 to 30,000 children that we're failing. And we consider that successful. To me, that is one of the major vulnerabilities or failure points of our system, is when we base our performance and our success on a 70, 80, 90% success rate, and we say that that's good enough. Your thoughts?
So the 20 to 30,000 children, for example, was just a number. And you're right, it does desensitize people who are in the field. However, people who are not in the field are the ones who then say, who can use those numbers to help them push for changes in legislation. So I'll give you an example. I had a family where the lady had 3 foster children, and then she was taking in teenagers all the time, right? And we were all wondering, why is she taking in only teenagers? These teenagers were actually disappearing from this woman's house. Mm-hmm. And the reason why they were disappearing is because they were then going to an uncle or somebody else that she called an uncle, and they were being used and exploited. So statistics are important when we have to prove that something is actually happening. Without numbers, we cannot say there's a problem. Without numbers, we cannot go to the state legislators and say, look, 1 in 2 kids at the age of 24 is going to have a job, but one of those children is not going to have a job, the other one is, which puts 50% of our population jobless after they age out of foster care. Those are statistics our legislators need in order to pass legislation. And that's why statistics become important.
If I may, Doctor, I don't disagree with you.
And if, Dr. Gopal, I think we lost your video. We still hear you, but is your camera marked out?
Yeah, my camera seems bright, and I can see myself on my camera. And I can see you all as still pictures. All of us are still pictures here. Do you want me to turn this off and turn it back on?
Okay, go ahead.
Give me about 3 minutes.
Okay. In the meantime, Chief, these numbers, you're making a point that it's not that you are against having statistics, it's just that in our country, we seem to get too comfortable with certain numbers, that it's like a tolerable level of harm. And that, I think that's the point you were making. Another point that I wanted to make insofar as the interest of the international human rights community in what happens to Americans is, can you imagine going to the United Nations saying that there's a problem that 1,000 Americans are experiencing? That would seem trivial, insignificant. But if 1,000 people were massacred in a third world country, I mean, you would have an international outcry. So I'm not saying in all instances that our concerns should take priority or should be have just as much priority as struggling countries, because underdeveloped countries are undeveloped countries, because there does have to be some prioritizing of resources. But I do think one American is one human, just like one person from any other country. And the numbers have a different way of getting interpreted when the United States, when Americans are involved. But that's part of what Janet Phelan is going to talk about in her presentation.
Can I add something now?
Okay, we have an audience member who wants to add something. Go ahead.
Well, no, we're talking about numbers and statistics.
Can you come? But can you sit here for a second so you're actually finished?
Okay.
And maybe introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Andre. Half missing anyway. No, my question was, we're talking about numbers and statistics, but what about the lack thereof as far as accountability in our criminal justice system, especially as it pertains to like numbers with attorneys, abuses and judicial abuses, stuff that does not come to surface. It's actually handled behind the scenes, and we can't actually, even if that information is available, there's no transparency for us to get it and assess when there is abuse of power or any other derivative information that we can obtain from it.
Can I reply to that, Dr. Crenshaw-Logal?
Yes, and Dr. Gopal, we got to talking a bit about numbers, and then we'll come back to the point you made.
That's fine.
Go ahead, Chief Whiteboard.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, Andre, and it goes to the issue of, if I'm the person who holds the statistics or the resource for that, and the release of that information is favorable to me, then by golly, I'm going to get that out and be the hero as a judge or attorney or chief of police or whoever. But if I'm the one who holds that resource and the release of that information is derogatory to me or my people, and I am able to hold that resource and not release that information, and that release is not obvious to people, then I'm able to do that. See, what I'm getting to is, this is precisely the reason why Dr. Crenshaw-Logal and I believe that an independent board of accountability should be at all levels in the criminal justice system. Because right now, the self-accountability, the self-management, you know, just in law enforcement, we have almost 20,000 different law enforcement agencies in the United States. 20,000 police departments and sheriff's departments, law enforcement agencies. Almost all of them are completely independent from the others. They are at, you know, various levels of government where probably 95% or more of the accountability and even visibility for the real performance of that agency is self-contained. There is very little independent or outside visibility, much less accountability, of those organizations. And if you suggest to them, for example, I was one of the few chiefs of police when I was in Washington State, and it was suggested that we have an independent municipal board that would look at us. And I said, you bet, come on in. I wanted that. I want to be as open and transparent as possible. I had fostered those relationships because that's the way I was brought up. But I got to tell you, most of my compatriots, most of my brothers in law enforcement would circle the wagons and say, oh no, we can't do that. Let me just end with one comment is, this goes to the core issue of what I think we should all be focusing on as a final solution, as you will, for the very sick justice system. is there has to be independent oversight for those levels of the justice system to take away that self-containment of the accountability, sir. Does that help answer at all what you brought up, Andre?
Well, I kind of knew that. I was just stating that, you know, if we're going to fix something, we need to have the numbers. You know, like we have all the numbers, let's say, you know, for the human trafficking and the children and all this stuff, but we have these forces that with minimal effort can not only destroy our life, but cage us, and we have no way of getting any information, and they can choose at will whether or not just by stating, oh, well, there's an ongoing investigation, therefore we're investigating ourselves and we're just not going to give you the information right now. And there's been instances where investigations have already finished and still information is not being released because it's whatever the word is.
You're absolutely right. I completely agree with you. And that is my only problem with statistics. I agree with everything that we're talking about with numbers. But so long as those numbers are within the authority of the holder of that information, who is also the subject of that information, and he or she controls the release of that, then I'm suspicious of those numbers. And I'm sorry, I'm just automatically suspicious when organization A holds the numbers for their own performance, for example, and they release that information or not and tell you, well, they're going to give you the good information, the good news, and hold the bad. I know that's cynical, and I apologize for that. But I've been dealing with this for 45 years, and I've seen more of that than of the other. Those numbers, those investigations, the visibility for that, I believe, needs to be independent and outside of the subject of those investigations or numbers, or it's automatically tainted. And with that, ma'am, I'm sorry.
Well, we made a lot of different points about the numbers, and we've addressed them from a lot of different perspectives. Dr. Gopal, what do you want to add to that discussion, if anything?
All I can say to you is that when you get negative numbers from the same organization, that's self-auditing is an important issue. But I totally agree that outside auditing is far more accurate and far more stringent than a self-audit usually is. What we have with many of these organizations is self-audit. But that's with the DCS, the Association for the Family and Children's Services. It is a self-audit. It's not an outside audit that happens. Those numbers that come is from that. But NIMHANS, the National Institute for the Missing and Exploited Children, those are numbers that are provided to them. They're getting these numbers from outside, and they're populating these numbers from different sources. So that's a different statistic when you get NIMHANS statistics versus the ACF statistics. And that we need to keep in mind.
Yeah, Dr. Jackson.
Well, what happens with statistics, sometimes they can be important to indicate whether a remedy is working or not. It's especially where you have an independent agency. It's like with polio shots. You know, the CDC indicated that the Salk vaccine was reducing polio, and some years later they came out with statistics that I knew by third grade is that cold shots didn't work. But that's not what the manufacturer told you. this is what an independent agency told you. So to that extent, I think statistics can be valuable.
Any closing remarks, Dr. Gopal?
No, I.
Well, thank you so much for a very, I thought, invigorating presentation, an important presentation, and giving us some view of these international concerns from a perspective a bit different from ours. You're starting at a different point in the chain of societal problems, and giving us a sense of why there's a need for international oversight. But I think that we've seen enough to see that we've got a lot in common, and I hope that we'll be able to continue working with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
At this point, we have Janet. Janet, how do you pronounce your last name? Janet, can you unmute your microphone? Can you hear us? She's having a little technical problems. Janet?
Maybe you can hear them.
There you go. How are you doing? How do you pronounce your last name?
Is she muted?
No, she's unmuted. She's having technical problems. This speaker is joining us from Latin America. Janet, can you hear us?
Janet, if you can hear us, we cannot hear you.
I'm afraid to publicly view the chat because everyone in the room can see it, and I didn't want to read messages from Gordon like, Zena, will you wrap it up? And I can't.
See how she is.
She knows they're there, though. She knows they're there.
I know they're there, but I didn't want you all to know that they were there.
Well, now we know. Just so it.
Let me see if I can reach Janet on another line. Ira, is there anything you want to add, because you have the benefit of looking at these problems from the perspective of everybody who's participated. We have some people want a clarification of what NGO stands for before we get started, and it's a non-governmental organization. So, Ira, do you have anything you want to add while I try to communicate with Janet separately from Zoom? Oh, no.
Muted.
He's not muted. We can't hear you, Ira.
Oh, he needs to put his headphones
on. Yeah.
He had his headphones last time we were talking.
He's just moving his mouth. He likes the attention.
We're all on the same board, by the way. The mic says it's working, but you cannot hear me. That's what Janet's saying. I really hope that she's able to get through, because this is a very helpful perspective. Dr. Gopal may have some idea about that, but let's see. This Ira comes back. Let's see if we can get Janet to speak on this. We want to talk about a perceived bias against alleged oppression of citizens from Western countries on the international level. But Ira, I think you were about to make a comment.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. No, I just actually want to commend the last speaker. I thought that presentation was absolutely outstanding.
Yeah.
And 100% on point. And I would welcome the opportunity. I did private message you, but I would welcome the opportunity to speak with you about your organization and what you do. And because I do work with encoded trauma, and you're absolutely correct about the amygdala and the limbic system is where it all goes on and where it all happens. And but nonetheless, I just thought your presentation was really outstanding. So thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna have, I mean, I think everybody did. I'm gonna ask Janet to log out and come back. So in the meantime, if anyone has questions or comments, and here, if anybody wants to take a quick break, we can do that.
I have one other question. Is it Dr. Paul?
Yes, yes, from State Coalition.
My question is, what type of background checks are going on? I guess deeper background checks are going on for foster parents, since you have the issues with the human trafficking and the, when they're taking in foster children. What, I guess, deeper precautions are going into place in these background checks?
So the background checks are basically to see if they have any history of criminal. It's a two-part background check, whether there's any federal crimes that they've committed, or they have a history of child abuse or neglect. That's pretty much what the background check is. The problem we're having is that we don't have enough foster parents. So our background check becomes very cursory. We have more foster kids who need to be adopted and placed in foster care than we have foster parents who are willing to take the kids. That's become a major problem.
Go ahead.
So
I've got a question for you as well. I had the opportunity to be at a family court hearing, and it was kind of concerning to me afterwards. I have a few questions maybe I can ask you. You might be able to answer me. You said you do like some assessments as far as what needs to be done and recommendations.
right, psychological assessments, right.
Right. There was, I'm not really sure if the lady that was in court testifying, but if she was like a caseworker for the kids or something to that effect. But what kind of requirements are there for those people, and do they vary from state to state?
They do. So caseworkers, for example, in Indiana have to have a master's degree. In Illinois and some of the other, not Illinois, but some of the other states, they don't. They can have a bachelor's degree in like 5 years in working with children, for example. So it varies from one state to another.
Now, here's an interesting, she was giving testimony, and then later on I asked a question, they answered it to me, but why is there not a requirement that if somebody is actually doing assessments, especially when it deals with family and children, why are there no requirements that, or prerequisites that maybe those people have kids of their own? Because it's kind of hard for you to know how a kid should be acting or whether the family dynamic is correct if you're working with theoretical things compared to knowing through being a parent. I mean, from an outside view, when you're single and don't have kids and you're looking at people that do have kids, some might say, well, that's ridiculous. Why are they doing that? And there's a lack of understanding behind what a family structure is or what the dynamic is between a parent and, the child. And unless you've experienced it, it's like telling somebody how they should be driving when you've never driven a car. Well, the book says, you're supposed to have your hands like this. You're supposed to do this, but you don't have the understanding behind it. And I'm wondering why the courts haven't caught up to that as a prerequisite.
So it's an interesting comment you make. It's an interesting discussion point. So one of the things people have asked me, they've asked me that question. I always say to them, what if you come from a dysfunctional family and that's the only way families are supposed to function? Then when you see a family functioning any differently, you're going to say, oh, whoa, that family needs help. I better get them out of that problem. So that's one way of looking at it. Another flip side to that perspective is that when I was younger and I didn't have kids, I can tell you that some of the people who had kids and they were working in the field, I had serious disagreement with the way they were handling the cases. Granted, I didn't have kids of my own, but a lot of it is common sense with raising children. Raising normal, healthy kids, there's a lot of common sense that goes into it. So it's like saying, for example, if you don't have a mental illness, how do you understand mental illness? Right? So we don't always have to have the experience in order to be able to work with that. If that helps you in any way.
Well, it's a little different, I think, with kids because, you know, like let's say somebody who's young and like the lady that I saw in court, she was fairly young. I would guess just got out of college and she's doing this. And just some of the things that she was commenting on, she was an only child growing up. I found out later. I was wondering, I was like, well, why don't y'all ask this in court? You know, do you have any kids? Did you grow up with any? You know, because just her viewpoints on the things were ridiculous. And, you know, it's sort of like the concept of, you know, I know when I was younger, if you go into a store and there's a child making a fit or crying or something like that, and the parents just ignoring them because all they're doing is trying to get attention. Well, somebody that doesn't know better, they'd be like, oh, well, that's child abuse right there. Why is the mother, you know, letting the child cry in the cart? That's just ridiculous. You know,
Right.
Heard of.
Right. It's like book knowledge versus actual experience. So one of the questions, this is really important because when they apply to become case managers, they're asked all these questions. If you see a child in a cart, right, and the child's crying, that's literally one of the questions, by the way, and the child is crying and the mom is acting like she doesn't care. She's like picking up stuff from the grocery store and the supermarket, you know, what would you do? And they actually grade them on how they respond.
And we have another comment. Well, I was just going to say, as a fellow healthcare professional, that's, you know, going to your, you know, if you don't have kids, how can you relate to that? But that's why, as healthcare workers, we put in those clinical hours. We put in that clinical work, and we do work in those scenarios before we're turned loose into the free world.
Yeah.
So we do have the opportunity to experience those things before we actually intervene with those situations.
But not only that.
But to speak to his issue, which is actually the more I think about it, and I want to respond to that a little more, because it's like, okay, this young girl, she's just come out of grad school, undergrad, wherever, she's just come out of school. What does she know about kids? You know, she's got a lot of book knowledge. She's probably got a practicum of what, 1,000 hours? So like an undergrad, for example, we'll have 1,000 hours of practicum. They have to go to a practicum site. They're under supervision. They're being trained. How can she tell me that I'm doing a bad job with my kid? And who is she without any experience whatsoever to tell me that? And I think that's something that we need to consider seriously and not minimize or marginalize that question, because we need to make sure that, yeah, if this child is coming, this young girl is coming out of school, who's supervising her? Who's advising her how this child where this child should be placed or how this child should be handled? So supervision, in response to your question and your concern, supervision is going to be very critical. And you can ask, hey, I'm not comfortable. I'd like some supervision. I hope this person has supervisor, and I'd like to deal with the supervisor.
And it's sort of a weight of evidence issue. Therefore, we had another comment from our
And I think from that too is not only picking those particular people, but you're talking about a system that's already understaffed, and to locate parents to have degrees.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up. I can barely, I'm sorry.
No, just the only thing I was saying is that you're talking about a system that's already understaffed, and to actually pick adults or parents that already have kids that have a degree in that area that they have to be certified in, you're going to be way understaffed to the point where you're not going to.
Exactly. Most of our new grads, and I sit on a child protective team. I've sat on it for 20 years, on the child protective team for Lake County, which is the county I live in. And the young girls that come up to me with cases, so we have an oversight, right, of DCS and how it works. And there's about 6 of us. There's me, there's another lady who's a medical practitioner, another person who's from the law, she's from the CASA. So we have a few different people on that team. And the young girls that come in there, they're very young. They're just out of college. They're very gung-ho. They have very clear ideas of what's right and wrong. but they bring their cases to the team. So this is a protective factor, right? You have risk factors, but you also have protective factors. So this is a protective factor where we oversee these cases. So remember that one child in one family has an oversight of several different teams. She has her own team that's overseeing the case. She has us as an oversight for the whole DCS, or looking on the case. So we make comments and we make decisions and we say, hey, wait a second, we don't like the direction you're headed. This does not sound right. Why don't you just give this mother some support? Do this, do this, do this. And then maybe come back next month and tell us what you've achieved. So there's oversight at different levels. And that's what makes me hopeful that, cases like this, where you're seeing this young girl right out of school, hopefully she doesn't make a huge blunder, because there's people like us and other people who are all trying to oversee the case. And remember, not everybody's an enemy. People are trying to really look out for kids' best interest. May not be doing it in a way that's necessarily enlightening, but
it's interesting, because one of the sacred arguments for not allowing anyone outside of the judiciary, certainly not outside of the legal profession, to do judicial oversight is the argument that you just don't understand the demands of being a judge. And that's not a response that should be poo-pooed. There are some very unique considerations. There are a lot of factors, there are a lot of pressures, and to be second guessed by everybody who figures it should have went another way. I appreciate that. That's why I'm not categorically against judicial immunity. And Chief Weiberg and I have talked, and I was surprised at how categorically he told me about how law enforcement can be uncomfortable with having anyone outside of their profession monitor them. So that's what struck me. That argument is a double-edged sword. But we have Janet, and we actually can see her at this time.